The letter arrived on a Monday. A crisp envelope with heavy stock and embossed script that seemed to sneer through the mail slot. It bore the name of my father's lawyer, Mr. Harold Granger, Esquire, a name that had always been spoken in hushed tones and inherited disdain. The return address alone told me everything. The old firm downtown, the one with cherrywood furniture and antique brass doorknobs that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. I hadn't stepped inside that office since I was 23, wearing my mother's old blazer and trying not to tremble as I asked for the smallest sliver of my father's attention. That day, he had dismissed me with a pen stroke. I remember it well. But now, at 39, the ink on this letter drew me back in summoning me to a final estate meeting regarding the assets of the late Mr. Lionel Braithwaite. My father, a man as stern as the statues he admired, as cold as the marble busts that lined our study, each one chosen to resemble a Greek philosopher he claimed I'd never live up to. And now he was dead. And somehow I'd been summoned. The meeting was set for Friday. Noon. Sharp. When I arrived, the waiting room was already thick with tension. My half-brother Silas wore a tailored navy suit that clung to him like arrogance. Beside him, our younger sister Juliet toyed with her Cartier bracelet, eyes scanning the room like a hawk distracted by its own reflection. I sat alone, deliberately, wearing no makeup, a thrifted coat, my mother's old brooch pinned like armor at the collar. They glanced at me with familiar condescension, unable to see the woman forged in the silence of being ignored. Harold's assistant, a tight-lipped woman named June, ushered us into the mahogany-lined conference room. My heels tapped softly against the parquet floor. The air smelled of old leather and forgotten truths. At the head of the table sat Mr. Granger, age having sharpened his features into something almost mythical. His fingers drummed the table as we took our places. Then came the words that split the room like lightning. This meeting is only for heirs. There was a pause, a moment suspended in time, where everyone looked to me with barely concealed derision, as if I had wandered into a room where I did not belong. I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into my worn leather bag and pulled out the documents, aged, notarized, and precise. Deeds, titles, signatures in my father's unmistakable hand. I laid them on the table like a gambler revealing a royal flush. "You mean the ones," I said evenly, "that already belong to me?" Silence. Then murmurs. I didn't need to look at Juliet to feel her confusion ripple across the table like a spoiled child denied her candy. And Silas, he was already leaning forward, his mind calculating possibilities, loopholes, ways to claw back what had just slipped through his fingers. Granger adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat. "These documents are valid. Executed 3 years ago. Mr. Braithwaite transferred full ownership of his real estate holdings to Ms. Eleanor Braithwaite." "My name," I said softly, "with stipulations regarding legacy management. He made these arrangements privately. I was instructed not to disclose them until now. Their inheritance simply vanished." The words didn't need to be spoken aloud. They hung there anyway, thick and choking. Years of expectation unraveled in a heartbeat. For a moment, I watched them as I had watched them my whole life, from the sidelines. But now I was no longer the overlooked daughter, the afterthought at holiday tables, the one who painted murals instead of chasing law degrees. Now I was the keeper of the land, the stone, the empire he had built, and finally, the one holding the silence that had once held me hostage. This was not revenge. It was revelation. And it was only the beginning. They didn't speak to me after the meeting. Not in words, at least. Silas stood so fast his chair groaned against the floor, jaw clenched like a trap ready to spring. He didn't look at me as he stormed out. Juliet lingered, fingers trembling slightly as she gathered her things, stealing one last glance that teetered between disbelief and betrayal. I remained seated. Let them walk away. Mr. Granger gave me a long look before collecting the documents and sliding them back toward me. "He never told them," I said quietly. No, he replied. He said they hadn't earned the truth yet. I almost smiled. Almost. The ride back to the manor, his manor, now mine, was surreal. I drove the same cracked road I'd once walked as a child after running away from the sound of shouting behind closed doors. Each turn held ghosts. The gnarled oak by the gate still bore the initials we carved with a stolen letter opener. S+J+E, circled in hearts that meant little in the end. As the house loomed into view, I slowed. The Braithwaite estate, 3 stories of stone and secrets, still looked regal in its aging frame. Ivy clung to its face like a stubborn memory. The windows stared back blankly, indifferent. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The same grandfather clock ticked in the foyer, counting heartbeats I no longer needed to sacrifice. The wallpaper in the parlor still peeled slightly at the corners, where damp crept in from storms no one bothered to fix. I touched it gently, recalling the night I hid behind it at 13, listening to Silas tell our father I was too soft to inherit anything but pity. And yet here we were. I wandered room to room, touching what was mine now. The study with its tower of leather-bound volumes. The solarium where our mother once played piano, long before grief dulled her fingers. The kitchen where I'd once stood barefoot at dawn, stealing strawberries when no one was looking. He had left it all to me. Not in a letter, not in a will, but in 1,000 quiet actions. Deeds signed. Trusts moved. Holdings concealed until the time was right. My hands shook as I opened the old desk drawer in the study and found the envelope he left. No name on it. Just the seal he'd always used, an etched griffin with fire behind its eyes. Inside, a single piece of paper. If they knew what it cost me to give you what I couldn't give myself, they might understand. Or maybe not. Let the truth be its own inheritance. That night, I didn't sleep. I lit a fire in the hearth and sat in the chair he used to occupy, facing the storm brewing outside. Thunder rolled. Rain pelted the glass. I sipped brandy from the cabinet he once said was too fine for everyday hands. Tomorrow, they would come back. Not with apologies. With lawyers. But I had the truth. And more than that, I had nothing left to fear. The letter came at dawn. It arrived not by post, but by courier, hand-delivered in a sleek black folder sealed with the crisp, impersonal mark of a downtown law firm. Tucked inside was exactly what I'd expected, a formal challenge to the property transfer. Improper execution, undue influence, possible mental decline. They were coming after me with sharpened teeth and polished smiles. I set the papers down beside my teacup, steam curling around the corners like fog. Juliet's name was at the bottom of the signature page, not Silas. That was interesting. Coward, I murmured to no one. Outside, the grounds were heavy with mist. The gravel driveway stretched long and empty, no cars yet, no journalists, no siblings. Just the rising hum of the storm. I called Mr. Granger before the hour struck 8. He picked up on the first ring. They're trying to unravel it, I said. He sighed. Of course they are. Let them. You sound too calm. I've handled worse. Your father anticipated this. Of course he had. Lionel Braithwaite had planned everything like a game of chess, always 3 moves ahead, always at the cost of love. I sometimes wondered if he'd ever wanted me to love him back, or if my loyalty had simply been convenient. I'm sending a forensic analyst to the manor, Granger continued. She'll review the documents and verify the signatures. I suggest you prepare for an inspection. I almost laughed. I was raised in this house like a tenant, not an heir. There was nothing they could inspect that I hadn't already memorized, every creak in the floorboards, every hairline crack in the library ceiling. I knew it all. Knew it too well. By 10, they arrived. Juliet first, stepping from a town car with the same dramatic flair she'd used at school plays. Her heels clicked angrily across the flagstone path. Behind her came her attorney, a man I recognized from society pages, divorce cases, and trust disputes. The kind who feigned empathy with eyes sharp as scalpels. Silas wasn't with them. Not in the car. Not anywhere in sight. So he was playing the distance game, letting Juliet swing the blade while he watched from shadows. Juliet walked past me without a word, heading straight into the foyer like she still owned the tiles beneath her. "Where's your lawyer?" she asked over her shoulder. I smiled. "She'll be here shortly. I hope for your sake she's better than the last one you hired when Dad cut your allowance." Her tone was sugar-dipped in acid. I didn't take the bait. She still thought this was about allowance, about Daddy's approval. But it wasn't. Not anymore. My attorney arrived at noon, Helena Ruiz. Mid-40s. No nonsense. She wore her hair in a twist, her glasses perched like armor, and carried a briefcase like it held the truth itself. Juliet's lawyer postured. Helena raised an eyebrow and said nothing. They spent hours combing through documents in the study. Every signature was there. Every page notarized. Every transaction executed with precision. At one point, Juliet cornered me in the kitchen, just like old times. "You really think this makes you part of the family now?" she hissed. "No," I replied. "I think it makes me the part of the family that doesn't lie." Her face changed. For a second, just a second, I saw the girl I once braided hair with, the sister who used to sleep in my bed during thunderstorms. Then it was gone. "You won't win," she said. I didn't respond. Because I already had. Evening bled into the manor like ink in water, slow, deliberate, impossible to stop. After the lawyers left, after Juliet's perfume faded from the air, I was alone again in the house my father once ruled like a monarch. Only now, the crown sat crooked in my hands. I walked the halls in slippers, echoing silently through rooms thick with memory. The chandelier in the dining room still shimmered with dust from decades past. I paused beneath it, remembering the first time I stood on that table at 8 years old, reciting my school poem while no one listened. My father read the paper. My siblings rolled their eyes. My mother smiled softly, then left the room before I finished. Even then, I learned, applause was for others. Until now. I opened the ledger room, the smallest in the East Wing. My father's obsession with paper trails had bordered on the manic binders upon binders of transactions, hand-labeled with surgical precision. Here was the true map of the empire. I lit a lamp and ran my fingers across the spines. Each one told a story. In 2004, he'd bought the Easton warehouse under a shell company, sealed off, never used. In 2009, the downtown apartments, registered in my mother's maiden name. By 2016, nearly every property bore subtle marks of division, trust split, names omitted, responsibilities handed quietly to me. No fanfare, no announcement, just signatures and shadows. Why? Had he regretted his absence? Had he tried, in his cold, calculated way, to prepare me for something no one else saw coming? There was one binder I hadn't seen before. It bore no label, just a leather cover worn at the edges. Inside, photos. Old ones. My artwork, scanned and cataloged. Receipts from the art supplies I used to hide under my bed. Letters I'd written to him as a teenager, never mailed. My voice, trapped in ink. He kept them. All this time. I felt something crack, quiet and painful, like a bone setting itself. The next morning, Silas called. Not his lawyer. Not Juliet. Him. "Eleanor," he said, voice as tight as I remembered it. "Silas. I'd like to meet. Privately." I paused. "Why?" "Because there are things you don't understand." He sounded different. Not angry. Not smug. Just tired. "Come tomorrow," I said. "No lawyers. No games." He agreed. And when I hung up, I knew something had shifted. Not just the inheritance. Not just the house. This story. For the first time, it was mine to tell. He arrived just after sunrise, as if darkness still offered him some cover. Silas stepped out of a sleek, low-profile car I didn't recognize, though it had the same smug sheen as his wardrobe, expensive, discreet, forgettable. He wore no tie, just a charcoal coat, and that signature mask of calm detachment. But when he looked at me from the foot of the front steps, something in his eyes betrayed him. Regret? No. Fear. I opened the door before he could knock. Let him come in on equal terms, even if everything about this place now whispered that he didn't belong. He walked slowly through the foyer, gaze flicking over the portraits, the flooring, the brass banister he once dared me to slide down when we were children. I waited until he spoke. You changed nothing, he said. Why would I? I want the ghosts to know I'm home. He smiled. Or tried to. You always had a flair for drama. Better than denial, I replied, and led him to the sunroom, once mother's sanctuary before she lost herself in gin and grief. It felt fitting. We sat across from each other. The table between us had a nick in the wood from the time he slammed his Latin textbook in frustration. I'd watched from the corner, silently translating the lines he couldn't memorize. He never asked for help, just glared until I left. Now he looked at me like I was an equation he couldn't solve. I didn't come to fight, he began. No. I arched a brow. Then what do you call that charming letter your lawyer sent? He waved it off, as if legal threats were mere drafts in the wind. Juliet pushed that through. She's furious. So are you. But you hide it better. He leaned forward, hands clasped. Listen, Ellie. Whatever else has happened, this house, this legacy, it wasn't supposed to divide us. I almost laughed. We were divided before we could speak. You just happened to win. He flinched. Just slightly. I spent a decade preparing for this role, he continued. Dad was grooming me to manage the holdings. I knew every tenant by name, every tax exemption, every loophole. I studied him, followed him, earned his trust. Then you. He stopped. Then you got everything. I finished it for him, silently. I don't want the estate, he said, surprising me. Not anymore. But there are properties. Assets that, they belong to the Braithwaite lineage. To all of us. We could divide them. Quietly. Cleanly. Ah, there it was. The bargain. The partial surrender. You mean, you want me to return your future? The one you assumed was waiting for you, tied in a bow, I said softly. The one you think I stole. No, he said, too quickly. Then yes. I stood. Walked to the window where the garden once bloomed. You didn't see me, I said. Any of you. Not when I stayed up cataloging invoices at 16. Not when I read every line of his investment books while you went to galas. Not when I asked for mentorship and was told to go play with my paints. He was silent. My father gave me this not because I asked, but because I was the only one who listened, I continued. He left you legacy, but he left me the truth. A long pause. Then, quieter. Is there any version of this where we don't destroy each other? I turned to face him. That depends, Silas. Can you live in a world where your sister isn't beneath you? Silas didn't answer right away. His silence stretched long across the room, deeper than the silence of absence. It was the silence of reckoning. He looked older than I remembered. Not in the lines on his face or the silver at his temples, but in his posture. Like the weight of expectation had finally begun to press into his spine the way it had pressed into mine my whole life. No, he said finally. I don't think I can. At least he was honest. More honest than most Braithwaites ever dared to be. That's a start, I said, not unkindly. He left shortly after. No handshake. No hug. Just a nod, brittle as old glass. I watched him drive off, the tires whispering through the gravel like a final word no one could hear. That night, I opened the safe in Father's study for the first time. I hadn't touched it since the documents surfaced. I didn't know what I was expecting. A will? A letter? More evidence of the chess game I'd inherited? Instead, I found something smaller. Stranger. A single Polaroid. Faded. Tucked inside a manila envelope with my name in block letters. The image was grainy but unmistakable. The three of us, Silas, Juliet, and me, sitting on the library floor. I was maybe 8. Silas 10. Juliet still with milk teeth and chaos in her curls. We were laughing. Arms tangled. Books open beside us. On the back, written in my father's unmistakable scrawl. This was the last day you all looked at each other without hunger in your eyes. I stared at it for a long time. I couldn't remember that day, but I could remember every moment after it, the morning after Silas's visit. I couldn't shake the image of that photograph, the three of us, untouched by the rod of expectation, laughter suspended in a time we no longer believed existed. It haunted me more than any threat of legal challenge because it whispered of a childhood that might have been real. I needed air. Not the manicured air of the estate gardens or the polished calm of the drawing room. I needed the attic. The attic had always been my refuge, the one place no one else cared to explore. Dusty, forgotten, too hot in summer and bone cold in winter. Perfect for a girl who learned early how to make herself small. I climbed the stairs with a flashlight in one hand and a key in the other. The old iron one, the one I wasn't supposed to have. Father had locked the filing cabinets up here years ago, after Mother passed. Said the past should be stored, not shared. He never knew I'd watched him hide the key behind the portrait of Uncle Graham in the east hallway. Men like my father never imagined their daughters were watching. The attic smelled of cedar and loss. I found the fireproof cabinet tucked behind the broken dress form and the boxes of holiday ornaments no one used after 2007. It took effort to wedge it open. The lock clicked with a sound that felt like the earth shifting. Inside were documents. Dozens of them. Land deeds, stock certificates, letters, and journals. 5 black notebooks, each with a year scrawled across the front. 2015. 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. I sat cross-legged on the floor and began to read. They weren't business records. They were confessions. In clipped, reserved prose, my father chronicled his growing disillusionment with his legacy, with Silas's ambition, with Juliet's obsession with image, with his own failures as a husband, as a father. Page after page traced his regrets, his realization that control was not love, that silence was not strength. And woven through it all were entries about me. She sees what the others ignore. She listens when I don't speak. Eleanor is the only one who doesn't demand the world and resent the weight of it. I read that line 5 times before I could move on. Toward the end, the entries became erratic, sharp, almost frantic. If I die before I make this clear, let the estate speak for me. She was always the heir. They just didn't know what that meant. I sat in the attic until the flashlight dimmed. My legs numb. My fingers black with dust. For the first time since this all began, I cried. Not for the loss, but for the truth finally said out loud. I didn't descend from the attic until night had fallen, and even then, I moved through the manor like a ghost. The journals weighed heavy in my arms, heavier in my chest. I placed them on the study desk, careful not to disturb the photograph still lying there, our smiling faces, captured just before the fracture. I poured myself a drink. Not brandy this time, but the scotch he used to reserve for serious evenings. I figured this counted. I drank it neat, like he did. Like I'd seen from behind cracked doors, too young to understand, too old to ignore. Then I opened the final drawer of his desk. He kept it locked always, the key hidden in a hollowed-out volume of Thucydides on the 3rd shelf. He assumed no one would ever touch his ancient war chronicles. But he never accounted for me. Inside the drawer, nestled in velvet, was a small wooden box. I recognized it immediately. It had once belonged to my mother. Pale cherry wood with a tiny brass latch. She used to keep her brooches inside, before the silence swallowed her, before the gin replaced lullabies. I opened it slowly. Inside, 3 items. A ring, simple, gold, likely her wedding band. A folded note, yellowing at the edges. And a flash drive. I left the ring and opened the note. Eleanor, he never could say it, but he chose you. Don't let them turn you into his secret. Make them see what he finally saw. It wasn't signed, but I knew her handwriting. She must have written it before she faded completely, before grief and resentment hardened her into someone else. The flash drive was cold between my fingers. I plugged it into the old laptop on the desk. Folders opened. Scans, contracts, recordings, all cataloged meticulously. The final file was a video, dated just 6 months before his death. The screen flickered, then settled on my father's face. He looked older, unshaven, less polished than I'd ever seen him. For a moment, he just stared at the camera, silent. Then he spoke. "If you're seeing this, Eleanor, it means they've finally come for what they think they deserve." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to pull years from his lungs. "They'll never understand what I did. But you do. You always did. The others, they inherited my ambition. You inherited my clarity. You saw through me, and I hated you for it. Until I didn't. Until I realized you were the only one I could trust not to ruin what I built." He leaned closer. "I made mistakes. With your mother. With you. But this, I got this part right. Let them fight. Let them burn. You are the only one who can rebuild." The screen went dark. I didn't cry this time. I sat there in the glow of a dead man's confession, and I smiled. Not out of victory. Out of relief. Because for once, I wasn't doubting my place. I was anchoring it. The morning after I watched my father's video, I walked the grounds before sunrise. The air was sharp with early frost, the kind that bites rather than lingers. I welcomed it. Let the cold wrap around me like proof that I was still here, still standing. In the northeast corner of the estate, hidden beyond the wisteria hedges, sat the old Braithwaite mausoleum. Few knew it was there. Even fewer visited. It was built 2 generations ago, when grief was grand and memorials were statements, not sentiments. Marble columns, ivy crawling up the sides like time trying to erase memory. Inside were names etched in stone, ancestors, soldiers, patrons of art and arrogance alike. My grandfather, his stern wife, uncles I never met. But not my mother. Not yet. And not my name either. Of course not. I wasn't meant to be remembered in stone. Until now. I walked the perimeter slowly, fingers brushing the cold marble. At the back of the mausoleum was an empty panel, reserved, perhaps, for those not yet deemed worthy. My name would be etched here one day. And this time, it would not be an afterthought. Back in the house, I met with Helena Ruiz again. She sat with her legs crossed in the study, flipping through the documentation I'd shown her the night before. "This flash drive changes everything," she said, tone clipped but reverent. "His intention is undeniable. And the journals? If you're willing to make those public, the court challenge will crumble." "I don't want spectacle," I replied. "I want closure." She looked up, curious. "Then why keep the house? The assets? You could sell, disappear, reinvent." "Because I lived in the shadows of this family for nearly 4 decades. I don't want reinvention. I want restoration." She studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Then we proceed." That afternoon, the second courier arrived, this time from Juliet's new counsel. A revised proposition. A settlement offer. They were rattled. Good. I didn't respond. Instead, I made an appointment with the Historical Society downtown. My father's properties weren't just valuable, they were part of the city's bones. I'd begun restoration plans, community initiatives, grants for housing in the lower-income buildings he kept pristine but inaccessible. He built the empire. I would open the gates. That evening, I stood in the West Hall, staring at the family portraits. Silas, Juliet, him, and then mine. A new one, commissioned quietly, hung while no one noticed. My face, not smiling, not posed, just present. For the first time, a name in stone, a face on the wall, a legacy reclaimed, The letter was my idea. I wrote it by hand, each word chosen like a stone in a mosaic, meant to last, meant to cut if needed. On thick cream stationery, sealed with the Braithwaite crest in deep maroon wax. Formal, final, unmistakably real. To Miss Juliet Braithwaite, Mr. Silas Braithwaite, and relevant counsel. Subject: the Braithwaite estate. Dear Juliet and Silas, there will be a gathering at the manor this Sunday at noon. No lawyers, no assistants, no interruptions. Just family. If you choose not to come, the decisions will proceed without you. Sincerely, Eleanor Braithwaite. It arrived by courier the next morning. I knew Juliet would open hers with a dramatic sigh and an eye roll. I knew Silas would read his twice, frown, and pour a drink. But they would come. They had to. Because this time, they weren't being invited, they were being summoned. Sunday arrived like a storm wrapped in silk. The air was tense, even the birds seemed to avoid the windows. I wore a black dress. Not for mourning, but for message. Authority. Legacy. They arrived 5 minutes apart. Juliet, in a navy dress that screamed apology dressed as elegance. Silas, in muted grays, face unreadable. We gathered in the solarium, just like the last time they were here. But this time, the sun poured through the tall windows like anointing light. Why are we here, Eleanor? Juliet asked, arms crossed, voice sharp. I gestured to the chairs. They sat. I didn't. I'm not here to argue about inheritance, I began. I'm here to offer you a truth you've never wanted. Juliet scoffed. Silas remained still. I spent my life proving I deserved a seat at this table. At every table. I didn't win Father's approval. I earned his trust. There's a difference. You see betrayal. I see responsibility. I placed the journals on the table. Then the flash drive. These are his words. His voice. His admissions. Read them. Watch them. Understand them. Juliet reached for the nearest journal. Her hand trembled slightly. I'm not erasing you, I continued. But I will not diminish myself for your comfort. Silas looked at me then. Really looked. What do you want from us? He asked. Nothing, I replied. And that's the difference. I want nothing, but I will no longer accept less than what I deserve. I turned to leave. Behind me, silence. But a silence filled not with contempt, with reckoning. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something else. Days passed. The manor settled back into stillness, but it wasn't the hollow kind anymore. It was full now of presence, of choices, of truths echoing off every surface once smothered by denial. Juliet didn't call. But she didn't sue again, either. Silas sent a brief email. 3 sentences. No apology, no affection. But he asked for a scanned copy of one of the journals. The 2017 one. The one where our father described Silas as a man shaped by mirrors more than morals. I scanned it anyway. Progress, perhaps. I spent the next week with blueprints and city planners, preparing restoration permits for the Easton warehouse. My plan was to convert it into a community arts and business incubator, part homage to the past, part investment in a future that looked nothing like the Braithwaites had ever imagined. Helena was delighted. You're not just winning the inheritance, Eleanor, she said during one of our meetings. You're rewriting the whole meaning of it. I smiled but said nothing, because it wasn't about winning. It was about release. One evening, I wandered into the old music room. It hadn't been used since Juliet's childhood recitals. The piano was dusty, its keys yellowed slightly. I sat down, pressed a note. It echoed like a voice relearning how to speak. I played a lullaby I remembered from Mother's rare tender moments. As the final note faded, I let my hand rest on the keys, breathing in a stillness that no longer felt lonely. That night, I lit candles in the garden. I invited no one. I sat beneath the arbor with a journal of my own. And I began to write. Day 1. Not of revenge. Of reclamation. Of learning how to exist without asking for permission. I didn't need a witness. I was finally enough for myself. It was late October when the first visitor arrived unannounced. I was in the garden, pruning what was left of the summer roses, when I heard the crunch of gravel under careful footsteps. I looked up to see a woman standing just beyond the gate. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, gloves too fine for the weather. Her posture was familiar, and so was the hesitation behind her eyes. "Aunt Cecilia," I said, wiping my hands on a cloth. Her expression cracked. "So you do remember me?" "I remember everyone who looked through me instead of at me." To her credit, she didn't flinch. Just stepped forward, through the gate, through years of silence. "I heard about the estate." "Of course you did," she sighed. "I was close with your father. Closer than most knew." "You were close to his power," I corrected. "Not the same thing." She pursed her lips. "You always were difficult, Eleanor." I smiled. "No, I was inconvenient." She glanced around the garden, avoiding my gaze. "He never told us he'd changed the documents. It blindsided the family." "I think that was the point." She bristled. "He should have left it to Silas." I took a step forward, keeping my voice level. "He did leave it to Silas. All the years of praise, the grooming, the name. What he gave me was responsibility. That's heavier." Aunt Cecilia's shoulders dropped. "I came to ask for a favor." And there it was. The real reason. Not to pay respects. Not to acknowledge me. To ask. "Juliet is struggling. She's drowning in legal costs. She may lose her flat." "I'm sorry to hear that. You could help." I nodded. "I could." Silence. Then I added, "But I won't." Her mouth parted slightly in shock. "She never helped me. Not when I needed it. And now my help wouldn't be charity, it would be silence. And I've had enough of that." She stared at me for a long moment. Then, without a word, she turned and left. I watched her walk away, slower than she arrived. Some ghosts don't return to haunt you. They come back to beg. And sometimes, you let them leave empty-handed. It was strange, the rhythm that began to form. Every few days, someone else from the shadows of my past would appear, drawn not by grief, but by the gravity of ownership. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, whispering about legacy and what your father would have wanted. Distant relatives reminding me of childhood summers they barely shared. Each one a soft knock wrapped in expectation. I kept a ledger. Not to tally grudges, but to remember the names of those who showed up only when there was something to lose. And something shifted inside me. Not bitterness, but clarity. My father left me more than land. He left me a map of human behavior. Of what people do when power changes hands. On a quiet Tuesday, I returned to the Easton warehouse for the first time in person. The building was just as I remembered, imposing, industrial, untouched. But I saw through the rust and grime now. I saw potential. A boy with paint-splattered sneakers sat on the curb, sketching the building. I approached slowly. "What are you drawing?" I asked. He looked up, startled, then pointed to the warehouse. "I like the way the light hits it in the afternoon. Makes it less angry." I almost laughed. "Angry buildings," I said, "are usually filled with people who weren't allowed to speak." He blinked at me like I'd said something strange and true all at once. "Will you paint it?" I asked. He shrugged. "Don't think anyone would let me." I knelt beside him. "What if I did?" He looked at me differently then. Like I might be the first adult who meant it. That night, I added a new name to the ledger. Not one who came asking, but one who gave something perspective. The building wasn't angry anymore. Neither was I. Just resolute. The manor had a long hallway, one that curved slightly to the left as if protecting secrets around its bend. At the end of that hall stood a mirror, a gift from my father's travels in Prague, ornate and unnecessarily large, like most things he valued. I used to avoid it, because for years, it only ever reflected what I was not. Not Juliet. Not Silas. Not chosen. But now I found myself standing before it, night after night, as if daring it to show me something new. And it did. My face, my steadiness, my scars subtle, but present. No makeup to disguise the sleepless nights. No silk to soften the edge. Just me, a woman who had inherited not just land or title, but a legacy of being underestimated. It's a strange kind of power, the one that comes from being invisible for so long. It sharpens you, teaches you to see what others cannot, teaches you to survive without applause. That night, I lit a fire in the old stone hearth. Not out of need, but ceremony. I sat on the rug like I used to as a girl when the world felt too loud and the only comfort was warmth and silence. I burned the old letters. The ones Juliet wrote only when she needed something. The birthday cards from relatives who signed their names but never remembered the day. The printed emails from my father's assistants reminding me I wasn't invited to this dinner or that board meeting. The paper curled and crackled. The smoke rose gently, like absolution. It wasn't about revenge. It was about letting the past go up in flame so that the woman standing in the mirror could finally breathe without its weight. Outside, the wind howled. But inside, I was still. And free. She arrived just after dusk, her knock hesitant, like someone tapping on old memory. When I opened the door, I saw her standing with a nervous smile and a bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. "Eleanor," she asked. "It's me, Clara, your goddaughter." The last time I saw Clara, she was 9, spilling apple juice on her velvet dress during Christmas Eve supper while Juliet scolded her in stage whispers. She was Juliet's child in blood, but mine in heart, once. A girl who used to sneak away during family dinners to draw with me in the art room before that room was locked and I was quietly erased. She was taller now. 17, maybe 18. Wide eyes, gentle voice. A hesitant soul, like someone who had learned early how to make herself smaller to avoid trouble. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. She entered carefully, as if the house might still punish her for joy. "I found your name in the deed registry," she said, voice trembling. "I wasn't supposed to know. Mom said not to get involved. But I had to see you." Her eyes watered. "She told me you took everything." I nodded. "And what do you think?" She took a breath. "I think she's wrong. And I think this place feels more like home now than it ever did before." I felt the weight of that. We sat in the drawing room, the same space where I'd once sat with her on the floor coloring the sky purple just because we could. She remembered those days. Every single one. "I kept this," she said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. It was a sketch I'd drawn of us, her holding a crown made of ivy, me smiling behind her. I'd signed it, to Clara, the girl who sees magic. She had kept it all this time. She didn't want money. She didn't want land. She just wanted to know the woman her family had buried in whispers. I held her hand and promised, "You'll never be erased again. Because the cycle ends with me. Because maybe the truest inheritance is the one that teaches us how to remember each other differently." It was Clara who found it. 2 days after her visit, she returned, this time with a determination that didn't fit the timid girl from before. She brought cookies and old questions. "I want to help," she said. "I don't know how, but this house, it's part of me too." So I let her into the archives. We called it that now, the narrow room behind the library shelves where my father kept records no one else cared to read. Blueprints, deeds, receipts for things long gone. Clara cataloged. I sorted. Together, we made sense of chaos. That's when she found it. "Eleanor," she called. "You should see this." I crossed the room and knelt beside her. In her hands was an envelope. Yellowed. Unsealed. No address. Just a date in the corner, dated 6 months before he died. Inside was a document titled, "Codicil to the Braithwaite Last Will and Testament." But it wasn't signed. I read it once, then again. It named me as sole executor, sole inheritor. It voided every previous clause. It laid bare his intentions in black and white, until the very end, where the signature line stood blank. Unwitnessed. Legally, it meant nothing. But morally? It was everything. He'd written it. He just hadn't finished it. Why? Did he run out of time? Or courage? I looked at Clara. This changes nothing in court, but everything in the story. She nodded. He meant for you to have it all, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. I placed the codicil beside the journals. Another piece of the puzzle. Not proof for the world, but proof for me, that even in his silence he'd been trying to speak. And now I was the voice he'd never learned how to use. The backlash didn't arrive as lawsuits or subpoenas. It arrived in pearls and perfume. Aunt Beatrice, the family's self-proclaimed moral compass, appeared one afternoon in a vintage Jaguar, stepping out in heeled boots far too tall for the gravel. Behind her were two other relatives I barely recognized, all lacquered in indignation and draped in cashmere like armor. They didn't knock. They marched. I met them in the foyer, where the sunlight framed them like a painting titled Entitlement, 1984. Eleanor, Beatrice began, voice brittle. We need to talk. This show you're running is disrespectful. The estate was built on tradition, and you're parading through it like it's your stage. It is my stage, I replied evenly. I've earned that much. You've alienated the family. No, I said. They did that long before I arrived. A hush. She adjusted her gloves. Lionel was a Braithwaite. He knew his duty to legacy. He wouldn't want this spectacle. Renovating the warehouse? Inviting press? Talking about housing equity? What are you trying to prove? That legacies can evolve. One of the cousins muttered, You think this makes you better than us? No, I said. I think it makes me braver. They demanded I rescind the development plans. I refused. They asked for a compromise. I offered a tour. They declined. Then you've made your choice, Beatrice said, turning on her heel. I have, I replied. And so have you. As they left, I watched their silhouettes recede through the stained glass door, icons of the old world, too polished to notice their own decay. Clara appeared beside me, silent until the car vanished. They'll never understand, she whispered. They're not supposed to, I said. Understanding was never their inheritance. She looked at me, eyes bright. What's ours then? Reconstruction, I replied. From the inside out. And we returned to the rooms they once ruled, not to erase them, but to rebuild the story they never dared to write. It was Helena who warned me. They're not done, she said, glancing over her glasses at the latest anonymous tip that arrived by courier, typed and signed, alleging fraud in the transfer of the Easton property. When legacy is threatened, people don't go quiet. They go underground. I believed her. I'd lived that truth long before I owned it. The tip was nonsense, of course. The records were clean, the signatures intact. Still, it rattled something loose. That night, I took the key from my father's drawer, the one shaped like a feather, more ornate than necessary. It opened a cabinet I hadn't touched in years, tucked behind the third guest bedroom's false wall. I remembered finding it once by accident as a girl and being told, harshly, to forget it existed. Inside was a single book, bound in red leather, titled simply, The Whisper Ledger. The first page read, to be read only by the Braithwaite who inherits silence. My breath caught. It wasn't a ledger at all. Not in the financial sense. It was a confession book. Names, dates, secrets. Not sordid, not scandalous, but truths we were never supposed to speak. My great-uncle, who loved a man he could never name. My grandmother, who wrote novels under a false name while pretending to hate fiction. Even my father, his earliest entries as a young man grappling with his love for architecture when his own father demanded industry. And at the very end, one sentence scribbled in trembling ink. Eleanor saw everything. She did not flinch. She must be the one. My heart broke a little for him then. For the man who'd built walls to hide his softness. For the father who could only say, I love you through loopholes and ledgers. I closed the book. And in that moment, I knew. This was my true inheritance. Not the house, not the wealth, but the responsibility to unbury the truth, one generation at a time. I found the clay figures in a shoebox beneath my childhood bed. Clara had asked me for old photographs, anything that shows what the house was before, she'd said, eager to build a visual timeline for the art initiative we were launching. I hadn't expected to find remnants of myself tucked behind dust and forgotten notebooks. The figures were crude, misshapen. A small woman with wild hair, a tiny book clutched in her hands. A larger man with blocky arms, perpetually frowning. A laughing girl with a painted crown and two eyes shaped like teardrops. Me. My father. Juliet. I'd sculpted them when I was 10. Back when I still believed love could be shaped by hands and hardened by heat. The colors had faded, but I remembered every brushstroke. I brought them downstairs, placed them on the drawing room mantel, where the oil portraits once hung like judgment. Clara came in as I was adjusting them. You made those? She asked. I did. They used to live in my closet. The only place they were safe. She smiled. They still look like you. It was then I knew what we would do with the Easton warehouse. Yes, we'd build the incubator. Yes, we'd install community housing. But the center of it, the heart, would be a museum of inheritance. Not a museum of wealth. A museum of memory. Of forgotten stories. Of women who shaped legacies from shadows. We'd display my clay figures. The anonymous journals from the Whisper Ledger. Even the unsigned codicil. Every item a testimony. That legacy is not what you receive, but what you recover. And in that museum, the first plaque would read, "For the ones who were never chosen until they chose themselves." As winter approached, the air in the manor grew sharp, full of things unsaid and unsent. So I began writing letters, not to the dead, but to the living. Not to explain, but to release. The first went to Silas. Dear Silas, we were never meant to compete, but that's all we ever did. You were chosen. I was overlooked. But in the quiet moments, I wonder if we were both victims of the same weight, just carried differently. I don't hate you. I don't envy you. But I no longer diminish myself to fit the spaces you made for me. Your sister, Eleanor. The second went to Juliet. Juliet. You were the storm, and I was the silence. But storms break what they can't understand, and silence records everything. I know you're angry. But I also know you're hurting. I won't fix that for you. But I won't erase you either. When you're ready to speak without rage, I'll be here. Eleanor. I wrote one to Clara, too, though I didn't give it to her. To my goddaughter. You saw me before anyone else did. And, because of you, I remember who I was before they forgot me. You're the legacy I never expected, but the one that matters most. Keep painting the sky purple. In the evenings, I'd sit by the window and burn the drafts I didn't send. Letters to distant cousins, to teachers who told me to smile more, to the version of myself who believed being useful was the same as being loved. Each flame was a farewell, not to people, to stories that no longer served me. And as the smoke curled into the rafters, I realized I was no longer defending my place in this family. I was defining it. And that was enough. It was Clara's idea. We should host something here, she said one evening, curled beside the fireplace with the clay figures lined neatly on the mantel. Not a fundraiser. Not a press event. A celebration. For the people who never got one. At first, I hesitated. The idea of opening these rooms or rooms that had witnessed humiliation, dismissal, exile, felt like tempting ghosts. But then I realized the ghosts had already been exorcised. Not through anger. Through presence. So we planned the winter gala. Not with caterers or chandeliers, but with intention. We invited artists, local historians, former employees of the Braithwaite properties. Tenants who now lived rent-free in the properties my father once used as assets and leverage. Children who painted murals on the Easton walls. Elders who remembered when the Braithwaite name meant distance, not warmth. The house came alive in a way it never had before. Laughter echoed down marble hallways. Feet danced where whispers once roamed. The fireplace crackled as people passed handmade ornaments to hang from the ancient pine tree. Clara insisted we decorate ourselves. And at the center of it all, I stood. Not hidden, not accommodating, just present. Midway through the evening, Silas arrived. No fanfare, no entourage, just a worn coat and eyes that no longer burned with entitlement. He approached quietly, holding a small, square box. For you, he said. Inside was a tiny brass key. I found it in Dad's old desk. He said it was the key to his first apartment. The one he loved more than the penthouse. Said he kept it to remind himself where he started. I held it in my palm. Cool. Heavy. You came, I said softly. I came to see what it looks like, he replied, when the right person takes over. Juliet never came. But that night, I danced with Clara in the drawing room. We spun barefoot on hardwood polished by 100 years of quiet. We didn't toast to triumph. We toasted to reclamation. To the quiet kind of justice. To the girl who once hid in closets. To the woman who no longer had to. There was one door in the manor I hadn't opened since the day he died. It was never locked, never marked. Just quietly avoided. Tucked behind the library, down 3 steps and a narrow corridor. It had no name, no sign. But we all knew what it was. The room where my father went to disappear. I waited until after the gala, after the candles had burned low and the music faded. When Clara was asleep and the guests had gone. I waited until the house returned to stillness, not the silence of suppression, but the hush of peace. I carried the feather-shaped key in my hand. The door opened with a sigh. The room was small, paneled in dark wood, lit by a single stained glass lamp. The desk was bare. The walls lined with shelves, each holding objects that defied easy explanation. A worn ballet slipper, a chipped compass, a single dried rose. Tokens, mementos, pieces of stories no one else had been allowed to see. In the center sat a trunk. Inside were letters. Hundreds of them. Not sent, not received, just written. To us. To himself. To my mother. To a God he no longer believed in. I sat on the floor and read until morning. His handwriting changed with age, tight and anxious in youth, sprawling and resigned in his final years. He spoke of shame, of longing, of a daughter he watched become a woman he couldn't quite name. In one, he wrote, I failed Eleanor by trying to shape her into someone small enough to carry. But she never needed carrying. She needed witnessing. I pressed my hand to the page. He never gave me this room while he lived. But he left it to me when it mattered. Not for forgiveness. For understanding. The next day, I labeled the door. Not with a plaque. With a poem. Here rests the truth too fragile for daylight. But not too late for love.